absolutely brilliantly into the next few questions. So, another smart Australian, there seems to be a lot of them, is a woman called Lisa Johnson, who's a psychologist, and she's written on the defence mechanisms that we, individuals, politicians, use. And she's got a recent piece on unwarranted optimism. The Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, who's a slight improvement on Tony Abbott, is pinning his hopes on renewable investment. And she's got the following questions. So, given that the prevailing political economic systems work against pro-environmental behaviour and social change, do you have any ideas on possible avenues of influence over ruling elites and or social norms? So, there's a longer question, but it's not your particular field, but what would you like to see happen?
The problem is for current elites to change, they are really, at least initially, to change rapidly, they're going to have to take notice of other elites. So there have to be some elites out there that are pushing a very different message. And at the moment, I think that's not happening. But that's not to say it couldn't happen. There are certainly moves from within academia, and actually I think that there are a lot of people sort of joke about academics being in their ivory towers. Nevertheless, I think the elites of society like to have the legitimacy that comes from university people, from academics, from the institutions of academia, supporting their view.
Professors as fig leaves.
Yes, yeah. Well, not as fig leaves. In this case, I think professors abiding by, and the broader research community abiding by what their research tells them. So actually, I think there is real potential, and we're already starting to see that. We are seeing more academic heads above the parapet than we had before. That people are prepared to stand up and say, "Hang on, the elites that are pushing for the status quo, that is completely at odds with the headline messages of things like Paris, for instance, or the headline messages of our existing government and governments elsewhere." So I think that is a really important driver. There are also some very important spokespeople, if that's the right term for them, advocates, people like Naomi Klein, for instance, at one end of the spectrum, but there are plenty of people on the other side, Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes arguing it from a slightly different position, but are making very cogent and strong arguments that we need to question the current paradigm
of economic growth.
Well, not just economic of economic growth, of the status quo, of the continued use of fossil fuels. I mean, the economic growth is one facet of that, and I personally think it's a very important one in the short to medium term, one that we mustn't shy away from discussing. But there are also interesting things like, if you look at the IMF, the recent report from the IMF demonstrated very clearly that if you took direct and indirect subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, they equated to $5.3 trillion for 2015. $5.3 trillion. That is more than the globe spends on health. That is a subsidy to apparently this sector that should be able to surely can survive on its own 2 feet after all the years it's been going. But oh no, the public sector has to continue to provide that subsidy to fossil fuels of $5.3 trillion. That's from the IMF.
I don't know how closely you read the IMF report, but some concrete examples of what is a fossil fuel subsidy. Is it the state stepping forward a checkbook so that a new port gets built? Is it tax rebates on diesel fuel?
It's all of these. It's all of these direct subsidies, like the ones you're talking about there, and there are many of those. And we can see some of the ones that have been given to shale gas here. And when I used to work offshore in the oil industry, there were lots of subsidies that were given to us effectively by allowing us dispensations from particular regulations during construction phases and things like that. But beyond that, they also look at sort of the damage that's caused, particularly the local health damage that is caused by fossil fuels. So if you're driving a diesel car in a city, as we're hearing about increasingly, then someone's have to pay for the asthma inhalers for the exacerbated level of asthma and bronchial problems that the people who live in the city suffer.
So privatise profit, socialise costs.
Yes, effectively, that is what it is. And if you add these together, the IMF, who have done a very thorough and very typical IMF, conservative approach looking at these issues, and they've included climate change in there, but at what some people would argue a very low value. But I actually almost like that because it does mean it's very conservative. 5.3 trillion. That dwarfs any subsidy to renewables. And I think what I'm trying to put together is that if there are a sequence of or a series of potential pivot points within the elites, whether it's academics, whether that's some of the vociferous advocates and spokespeople, like Klein to Oreskes, or even the Gores of this world. I mean, I have my concerns with his approach, and obviously also people like Stern and so forth. And then on top of that, you've also got bodies like the IMF saying this is really important issue. We've got the World Bank coming out and saying that at 4 degrees C the world would be having fights over food and water. So we've got the UN already saying a lot of these things as well. So we are seeing what we normally see as the elites. Even Mark Carney coming out from the Bank of England and saying this is a hugely important issue. So I think partly this feeds back between both the psychology point of view and Clive's point of view. There are very strong messages that Paris is helping to reinforce and giving more. It's helping those of us who want to step forward with a bit more substance behind our in a sense provides us with a bit more courage, because we know there's something behind us now, rather than beforehand we put our head above the parapet and we felt there was no one else there behind us.
This is going to sound sycophantic. I've known you 10 years and never seen you lack courage.
Well,
anyway, but you think it's going to be easier for other people?
I already am seeing it being easier for a lot of other academics. I am hearing more academics speaking out. I'm seeing more academics speaking out. I'm seeing more, in a sense, more the public prepared to stand up and fight for particular cases. So I think we asked that there is some mobilisation, which is within the elites and is influencing the elites. Now the problem is, will it be able to make the sufficient influence in the time frame that we have? I think it probably will not. I think we will probably we'll probably head for 3 or 4 degrees centigrade. But that's not set in stone. And it may well be that what we do see is a very rapid sort of emergent catalysed change that does see an almost flip in the current system. If we do not see that, then we are not going to resolve climate change at anything below a 3 degrees C temperature.
Non-linear social change to cope with the likelihood of non-linear climate change.
Yes, I think that puts it quite well, actually. And I think this is why, in some respects, I think you'd have to talk directly to Nick Stern about this, as someone who I have a lot of respect for. I think he genuinely thinks climate change is a deeply important issue. But I think he and I would take a very different position. And he would probably, undoubtedly, I'm sure he would disagree with some of what I'm saying, not necessarily the content, but about the framing of the issue. As I think the approach that he has taken, and the approach that quite a few people are taking, that we can change we can resolve climate change within the current system. I think that's probably the case in 1990 when the first IPCC report came out. It was probably the case in 2000. In 2015, if we're serious about what we signed up to in Paris, i.e. well below 2 degrees centigrade, then I can see no way at all that we can square the current system, the current paradigm, economic paradigm and political paradigm, with resolving and reducing emissions in line with 2 degrees C, or possibly even 3 degrees centigrade. And I think the only way that Stern and many others are able to do that is by holding out this hope that negative emissions, some point later in the century, will be able to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I think though we come at the position, I think people like Stern and I both think it's a hugely important subject, that we need to make very significant change. I think we then part company on what's the right route forward.
I wasn't at Climate Camp 2007, but George Monbiot was, and he talked about negative emissions, and it was a laughing point. I mean, it was patently absurd.
Yeah.
But in the space from 2007, when to now, it's now taken seriously.
I mean, the point I've tried to make, and I think I've heard a few other people saying this as well now, is that initially it was an incredibly risky insurance policy. It probably would not work.
Plan C, Plan D, or Plan E.
Yes, probably Z11 probably as a plan. It was a long way down there. But anyway, it was and I think it's appropriate that people were looking at it. But the problem is now it has become the one and only plan. It's not Plan A, because Plan A suggests there's a Plan B. This is the plan. The plan is to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere in the future. And more disturbing than that, it's the plan that no one's allowed to talk about. So it is a hidden plan. So we have the headline messages, and yet no one is really prepared to say, well, what does that entail? Now again, what we're hearing are more academics speaking out about this. There are lots of academics who are deeply, deeply concerned about the assumptions that are embedded in the models that are informing the policies that we can rely on negative emissions in the future. So there are academics speaking out about this. I also think we should say on the record that I personally think we should be researching negative emission technologies, and possibly even some of the geoengineering technologies, the sort of radiation management approaches. But I say that very cautiously, And actually,
I didn't expect to see you advocating sulphur cannons.
no, that's one of the ones I probably would not be suggesting.
Okay.
But so, for instance, one of the ones which is to vaporise seawater and using the salt from the seawater as a cloud condensation nuclei, and possibly the clouds may be able to help. I think we should be able to. I'm not saying that's going to work, but I think we should be researching these issues. But we should be approaching climate change categorically as if they do not work. Yeah, there should be no assumption that these will work. These are very likely to fail, and they are, even if they could succeed, they probably could not succeed at scale, and they will probably be too late. So we have to approach mitigation as if they will fail. And that's a challenging thing to ask policymakers to do that. You have to park these assumptions. Now, at the moment, we already know that these assumptions are changing the policies today. That's why we can have the Paris Agreement, because people assume that these things will work, but because we won't talk about them. I think we should talk about them, I think we should research them, and I think we should assume that they will not work. I also think every pound or euro or dollar we spend on geoengineering, we should spend $10 on understanding what it is we would need to do immediately and how we could deliver immediate change in our levels of emissions. Because reductions in our emissions immediately have an effect. Reductions in emissions by speculative technology in 2050 may have no effect and may be too late.
We'll come back to that. So Lisa Johnson's second question. Do you think that funding renewable energy and climate adaptation without funding awareness-raising campaigns is driven by this unrealistic technological optimism, or do you think that there's a more willful neglect? So I suppose it's cock-up or conspiracy. You know, is it just inertia that we're focusing on windmills and BECCS, but we're not spending any significant money on getting people aware of just how dire the situation is?
I mean, there's an assumption there that there are some people somewhere who really understand how dire the situation is. I think this level of cognitive dissonance goes right the way through the climate change community. I think very few of us in the climate change community are really prepared to accept how serious the issue is. And it comes back to her first point. One of our coping mechanisms is to be incredibly optimistic. Most of the scientists I meet are incredibly optimistic. The problem is, I think, even many of those now, the situation is getting so dire that they can't even hold their own level of optimism anymore. So I think that is starting to sort of peel away. But nevertheless, I think I still think it's difficult to imagine that any of us really are prepared to recognise.
You and Jim Hansen.
Well, I'm sure that
a few others.
There are a few people, and I still think probably I struggle as well a lot of the time. I mean, I notice when I'm trying to develop scenarios about how bad it could be, I always find myself thinking, oh well, that probably won't happen. It was more likely to be this, and I still find myself repeatedly trying to be more optimistic. Now I'm trying to be quite reflective about that when I'm doing that process, and trying to learn from it. But I think all of us tend to sort of err towards that slightly more optimistic end of the spectrum. So the assumption is: are there people out there that can push forward a more objective message, a clearer message that is not confused by naive optimism? There probably are now. That's probably coming to that point. But I think the reason we haven't pushed it before is because I don't think many people were to a position where they thought it was that serious. Even those of us that work in the field. I spoke to quite a few scientists, and they were generally scientists less than engineers. At the recent COP in Paris, and many of those were incredibly optimistic about what we'd be able to deliver with technology. I think there's a big difference between science and technology. I think most scientists have never built technology at scale, and I think they assume that technology at scale is just
take it out of the lab,
book, the textbook, and hey presto, out pops this thing that looks like it did in the sketch or the diagram or the CAD package back in the lab.
No battle plan survives contact with the enemy.
No. So I still think even those people who I know see climate change as a really serious issue and work on it on a day-to-day basis and have done for decades. Many of them are incredibly optimistic, in my view, very naively optimistic about what we're about to deliver technically, and still see themselves carrying on their lives, their personal lives, and the way that the world works currently. They see that as continuing. And we're about to technically try to make a transition to a zero or low carbon future, or be able to suck the CO2 out of the air in the future. So I think there's still a battle to be had within the scientific community, within the climate change community, within the expert community, about the severity of the challenges that we actually face.
Before we even get to the politicians who are up against very different constraints, because a scientist just has to keep publishing, a politician has to keep getting elected.
Yes, yeah. Though having said that, I do think I would like to separate out adaptation and wind turbines, if you like, or renewables. I think these are quite different. I think there can be lots of arguments within the current system that can be pointed towards renewables. I don't think we carry on with fossil fuels because they are economically the most viable way forward. I think we carry on with fossil fuels because we're locked into using them, and we post hocly justify those on the basis of spurious economics.
Locked in economically, technologically, psychologically,
every single way. In every way we are locked into fossil fuels. But we justify that, as we always like to think ourselves as rational beings. So we justify that on the basis of well, particularly in terms of economics. It is cheaper to do this. Well, what do we mean by cheap? I don't think, if you look at the IMF report, and if you look at just the amount of damage that's been caused, we don't require economists to work out abatement curves and cost damage curves and so forth. This is blatantly obvious to anyone with an IQ in double figures that the damage and the costs of fossil fuels are very high, and that there are plenty of means of transitioning to some of the more mature renewables that we could be doing very rapidly indeed. We're choosing not to do that, and we're choosing not to do it not because they are more expensive, but because we like the current system. We are locked into that system. We're reluctant to make those changes.
Well, the people who get to make the decisions about whether we continue and whether we continue to subsidise are benefiting from the current system, and it's a classic incumbent actor.
Yeah, we all benefit to some extent. I mean, is it hard to understand why is it that the current government is benefiting from the current system? Now they get tax revenue from the fossil fuel industry, probably not as much as they should be getting, but they get tax revenue from that. They could get tax revenue from the renewables. Once the renewables are out there and working at scale, they can obviously tax the profits of those.
But we can see the power stations now, and there's a wonderful quote from Machiavelli about people bringing forward from the Prince about the danger of bringing forward something new is that the constituencies that it will benefit from that new thing doesn't exist yet, but the constituency that benefits from what's going on now does exist.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, George Osborne works in London. George Osborne is breathing in the particle fumes that are put out by the diesel buses that pass by the House of Commons. Maybe they've got a barrier around it, only electric buses around there. But the elites are already suffering, and their children, even if they are at fancy schools, they are still going to be suffering the implications.
They'll get better doctors, though.
Well, they may get better doctors, but that doesn't resolve some of these problems.
No, sure.
So I just think that that we are, in a sense, I don't think it's quite as clear cut as the elites are only benefiting from it. I think there's something much more deeper psychologically in the idea that we're locked into the current system. In a sense, we're often afraid, although we embrace change in some respects, we're often afraid of change in other respects. And I think it's one we are. Yeah, and for some legitimate reasons, there is a big difference in going from a centralised thermal power station base, and we're just here focusing on electricity, to a system whereby you're relying on a diffuse and potentially more intermittent. Though I think these problems are hugely exaggerated, but nevertheless it's a different system. So moving from one to the other, there are some genuine issues of concern there. But nevertheless, I think it is remiss of the government. I think it's foolish of the government to have begun dismantling the support for renewables. I think that was incredibly foolish, because it's not that they need the support to be economically viable. They are already, in my view, economically viable. They are already much cheaper than fossil fuels, and I would suggest the IMF report would even suggest that. The reason we've not gone down the renewable routes is much more to do with the other forms of locking, which are not economic, and therefore we have to keep supporting the renewables because we have to push the incumbent off its perch. Not just in addition to, we have to actually push it off the perch. We have to leave the fossil fuels in the ground, and we are only going to do that if we are prepared to make a very rapid and wholesale shift to this alternative system. And we're not going to be able to just do that by a few solar panels on roofs and so forth. We need something much more systemic, and I think the government could have carried on pushing the renewables much harder than they have done.
Yeah, I mean, there's a rather good paper on destabilisation of incumbent regimes and the tactics that they're able to use to defend themselves, and of course that's partly sort of what my PhD is on as well.
Yeah.
Maybe for another time.
Yeah, but I mean, that is really important, and the incumbents, of course, they have the voice of government more than anyone else. I mean, the ear of government, or the voice of government, maybe they have the voice of government.
Well, voice as well.
Yeah, but they've certainly got the ear of government much more than the new players have. Now, I think that is changing, but it's not changing anywhere near rapidly enough. I mean, the problem with all of this is the big backdrop to all of this is time,
speed and scale.
Yeah, that's the big issue. I think we will make this transition, but I don't think if climate change wasn't here, we probably would make the transition anyway, because there were lots of benefits of moving away from fossil fuels. But I don't think necessarily we're going to make the transition within the climate change time frame unless we are being much more interventionist.
historically, these transitions have taken decades,
Yeah.
centuries.
Yeah, I mean, I think typically that is the case, and there are some examples, I think, when things have occurred more rapidly, and I think that's something we need to investigate much more seriously than we have done. And there are lots of people looking at this, but there's lots of discussion within the transitions expertise about how rapidly things can occur.
Yeah.
And obviously we always hear the metaphor of war. During wars, rapidly things change, but then you can also use the Apollo project, which might be a slightly more positive way to think about it, but there's still nothing like the sorts of scale change we would need in terms of fossil fuels. And the one that I repeatedly use is advisedly is the one of Margaret Thatcher, and I think actually the change in the value system within the UK and actually I think across much of Europe, and indeed to some extent within the US with Reagan and so forth, that occurred very rapidly indeed. So I do think that what we saw there was, if you went back to 1976, 77, I think very few people in the UK would have said that they would think it was appropriate to privatise state monopolies. You know, maybe fine with British Leyland as it was at the time. But if you're talking about water and electricity and telecom and so forth, and gas, I think many people in the train network, many people have said these are natural monopolies and these belong to the state, and indeed all the land that goes with them belongs to the state. Within 5 to 10 years, the same people were buying the shares in the privatised companies and making very strong arguments that it was appropriate to do so. I think the value change that occurred during that period, I don't think it was a good value change, so I don't like the way it went. Nevertheless, I think that we had that very rapid value change that occurred within about 10 years without an external threat, any external threat like a war. I mean, there was some issues with the IMF and Callaghan and the budget and so forth in the mid-70s, but that was and then of course the oil price shot. But these are very small compared with sort of war-type metaphors. I think it's interesting that very strong leadership drove a value change. And that value change is as important as is the technical change, because I think a lot of what we need to deliver will not be delivered through technology. Some will be, and actually technology is never delivered in isolation anyway. It always comes with value change.
Yeah.
But there are other things that value change can deliver which doesn't require technology. So I think there are behavioural, habitual, routine type changes that we can make to how we live our lives that could have big impacts in terms of climate change.
We'll come back to that in a minute. When you were talking about your coping strategies or the difficulty that you have in sort of realising how bad it might get, it put me in mind of an article that appeared in Esquire called "When the End of Human Civilization is Your Day Job." I don't know if you saw it.
I'm not a regular subscriber to Esquire.
It focuses on Jason Box, who looks at methane release, and he now lives in Denmark. And the article talks about the coping strategies that scientists use in their day job when looking into the abyss. So what coping strategies do you use to try to stop the abyss looking into you?
Interesting. I mean, there's the obvious ones, but what are the distractions that I have that take you away from it? Like cycling and rock climbing. So that's helpful. My closest friends are not academics. I don't feel particularly at home in academic environments. I don't mind being in academic environments. I like the process of argument, but actually I think the process of argument is no more cogent and sequentially rational within universities than it is in any other area that I've worked previously. So I think we're more eloquent. We have better education and slightly longer words and more syllables in universities. I don't think it's necessarily anything that's particularly more astute that goes on here than elsewhere. So I tend to find that by moving outside university, that helps as well. So my friends, in that sense, help a lot. But also, I think there is a chance, and every time that we have these films, the chance is smaller. But I think there is a chance that we could avoid the abyss, and it is very positive to be involved with that. And it's very, in a sense, there's a real privilege to be involved in something where you are trying to avoid the abyss. I've been fortunate enough to be equipped with a wherewithal from family, from my previous jobs and my sets of interests, to be in a position now where hopefully I can make some useful contribution to try to avoid the abyss. Now that is a good position to be in. It's a position of agency. It's a position of I wouldn't say influence and power. It's not a position of either of those, but it's a position of understanding that we can do something, and then trying to push that forward. So that's upbeat. Now that I think we will fail, I don't have a real problem because I don't know that we will fail. And whilst I think there is a small chance of success, that I suppose that combined with my rock climbing, cycling, running, and having a good bunch of friends, that that allows me to carry on working in this area because there is some hope. If I thought there was no hope of significantly constraining the levels of climate change, then I would certainly leave this job. I would. I hope the skeptics are right, and I would be incredibly happy to say that I've completely wasted the last few years, and I apologise profusely. The skeptics are right, and I can wander off and do something much more worthwhile and enjoyable in my life. I wish that was the case. I think it's almost, well, I don't think, as far as I know anything, they are wrong. Climate change is a serious issue. We understand why it's a serious issue physically. We understand what we need to do about it. And we know the time frame is very short.
I don't know if you saw a new piece.